Welcome back to Unsolicited Feedback, the podcast where we cut through the noise, skip the corporate jargon, and get real about what actually drives results. Because let's be honest, hope is not a business strategy. I'm your host, Chuck Knabusch, the operations guy, and after 40 plus years across the military, corporate America, and now entrepreneurship, I've seen what works, what breaks, and why leadership planning and execution are the great separators between average and exceptional results. As you're catching the replay, send your thoughts or challenges directly to me at chuck@1310.com, chuck@13ten.com. Hey, your time matters, so let's jump straight into today's topic. Why new leaders fail in established organizations. And it's not what you think. Let me tell you a story. I was working at a new manufacturing facility with a brand new plant manager. Great guy. I'd worked with him before. Strong people skills. Deep continuous improvement background. The kind of leader who actually improves things instead of just talking about improving things. But he walked into a trap. Not because he was unqualified. Not because he lacked competence. Because the system didn't tell him the rules of the game. He was invited into a plant manager's meeting with his peers. First time in the room. No onboarding playbook, no briefing, no KPI template, no definitions. Then in the meeting, someone asked, "Why didn't you submit your performance KPIs before the meeting?" He didn't even know that was expected. So the following week, he pulled the data together and submitted his KPIs. The next meeting, where did you get those numbers? The week after that, how did you calculate them? And just like that, credibility erosion begins. Not because he didn't know his business, because no one had defined the rules of measurement. No one took him under their wing. And here's the kicker. His peers didn't go through this. They inherited existing plants with KPIs already defined, established metrics, standard calculations. They didn't build the measuring system from scratch. He did. This is not a KPI story. This is a leadership system story. And today we're going to break it down. Number one, this is the biggest problem. Organizations expect performance without defining the measurement system. Let's be blunt here. Most organizations do not have a leadership operating system. They have habits. They have historical metrics. They have tribal knowledge. They have, that's how we've always done it. But they don't have documented definitions. They don't have calculation standards. They don't have onboarding clarity. And when a new leader steps in, especially in a startup plant, turnaround, or greenfield activity, they are judged by unwritten rules. And that's the real problem. The issue isn't performance. The issue is invisible expectations. Here's a hard fact. According to Gallup, only 50% of employees strongly agree they know what's expected of them at work. 50%. Among managers in new roles, that number drops further in the first 6 months. And when expectations are unclear, performance drops by as much as 25%. So what happened to this plant manager isn't unusual. It's pretty common. He wasn't failing. He was operating without a shared definition of success. Here's an additional challenge. Measurement without standardization. You can't compare leaders fairly when KPIs aren't defined. Formulas vary. Reporting cadence isn't standardized. Data sources aren't aligned. That's not accountability. That's ambiguity with pressure. And ambiguity with pressure ultimately erodes trust. So here's the biggest symptom. Leaders experience credibility whiplash. Here's what happens internally. Week 1, why didn't you send those KPIs? Week 2, where'd those numbers come from? Week 3, how are you calculating this? Each question sounds innocent, but collectively it signals we don't trust you or your data. And when trust erodes in leadership forums, 3 things happen. Defensive reporting begins, risk-taking decreases, and political behavior increases. Research from Harvard Business Review shows that when leaders feel their credibility is questioned in peer groups, they shift from performance orientation to image management within 90 days. So instead of asking, how do we improve throughput? They start asking, how do I not get embarrassed next week? That's dangerous because organizations need leaders solving operational problems, not protecting reputations. So what do most people try to do to fix the problem? Well, here's what typically happens. The new leader works harder. They over-document. They over-explain. They double-check every calculation. They create more slides. They gather more data. They try to prove competence. And sometimes they even mirror whatever numbers the group seems comfortable with. This is the classic response. If I just produce better data, they'll accept me. But that's the wrong battlefield, because this isn't a data problem. It's a system definition problem. You can't win a systems debate if standards were never defined. How about a counterintuitive insight? More data rarely solves credibility gaps. In fact, it can worsen them, because when definitions aren't aligned, more numbers create more opportunities to question methodology. The leader becomes trapped in explaining math instead of leading operations. So let's be honest here. When an organization lacks a standardized KPI framework, every leader builds their own interpretation. And when interpretations differ, comparison becomes political. This is what's happening. Other plant managers inherited KPI systems that were established before they even arrived. So they weren't defending the math. They were inheriting it. This new plant manager was building it. So his numbers were under a microscope. It wasn't personal. It was structural. But structural problems feel personal. Here's a hidden dynamic. When someone builds a system from scratch, it exposes inconsistencies elsewhere. If he defined scrap rate differently, if he calculated OEE with tighter rules, if he counted downtime more rigorously, his numbers might look worse. Not because performance was worse, but because integrity was higher. And that makes peers uncomfortable. There's an old saying in operations, the first honest number always looks bad. McKinsey research shows that organizations with standardized performance definitions across business units outperform peers by 20 to 30% in operational efficiency. Why? Because leaders spend time improving performance instead of debating measurement. So, what's one thing we can do to actually move the needle? Here's the move. Instead of defending numbers individually, call for standardization collectively. This shift might sound something like, before we continue comparing results, can we align on definitions? I want to make sure we're all measuring the same way. That's not defensive. That's leadership. And it does 3 powerful things. 1, it reframes the conversation from my numbers to our collective system. It removes personalization, and it exposes structural gaps safely. This plant manager didn't need to prove his math. He needed to elevate the conversation because real accountability requires shared definitions. If you don't define the game, you'll be judged by invisible rules. Organizations love performance dashboards, but dashboards without definitions are decoration. You can't Compare OEE without standard downtime rules. Compare labor efficiency without identical hour classifications. Compare scrap without consistent material cost allocation. Or compare safety without aligned incident definitions. Without shared definitions, meetings become subtle credibility audits, and that drains leadership capacity. Let me tell you what should have happened. When the new plant manager entered the role, someone should have said, here are the KPIs we track. Here's how we calculate them. Here's the data source. And here's the cadence. Here's what good looks like. Instead, he walked into a room where those standards were implied, and implied standards are the fastest way to erode psychological safety. Edmondson's research on psychological safety at Harvard shows that teams perform best when expectations are clear and questioning is safe. But questioning without clarity feels like interrogation, and that's the difference. So if you're a senior executive, ask yourself, do we have written KPI definitions? Are formulas standardized? Do new leaders receive measurement onboarding? Can two plants calculate OEE the same way today? If not, you don't have a performance system. You have historical reporting habits. If you're a new leader walking into ambiguity, don't overproduce. Don't defend endlessly. Elevate the conversation to definitions. Ask, what formula are we using? What data source is the standard? Are these definitions documented somewhere? If the answer is no, you found the real problem. The biggest problem isn't bad leaders. It's undefined systems. The biggest symptom isn't weak KPIs. It's credibility erosion. Most people try to fix it with more data, and that rarely works. Because you can't win a measurement debate without shared standards. The move? Standardize before you optimize. Define before you defend. And if no one hands you the manual, write one. Then invite the room to align, because performance without shared definitions is chaos wearing a spreadsheet. And spreadsheets don't run plants. Leaders do. Hey, if this resonated, share it with somebody who's walking into a new role. And remember, hope is not a business strategy. Clarity is. Execution is. Alignment is. I'll see you in the next one. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Unsolicited Feedback. Thanks for joining me, but don't just nod along. Apply something from today's conversation. Because results don't show up just from listening. They show up because you did something. Even one small action this week will move the needle further than a month of good intentions. If you want to go deeper, scan the QR code or schedule a 30-minute chat. I'd love to hear how you're using planning, leadership, and execution to make sure hope never becomes your business strategy. Drop a comment and like the episode. I'm Chuck Knabusch. Until next time, stay focused, stay disciplined, and don't you dare rely on hope.